It's good to have everyone joining us for Hanukkah. It's a difficult time, so it's nice to see some faces and some names and to feel that we're all sharing in each other's Hanukkah and giving chizik to one another. I have a lot of grandchildren in my house, so quite a few young men in the army. His children bunking up with us. So maybe a little noisy and maybe interrupted by some of my grandkids. I asked them not to come in, but you know how that works. May or may not work. Okay. Hanukkah can invite a lot of very simplistic thinking. What I mean is as follows. It's a perfect setup for people who are predisposed against anything of Western influence to employ Hanukkah as the paradigm for our heroic and defiant stand against anything Western, anything Greek. This is our chance to once again reestablish the fact that we take nothing from any culture outside of our own. First of all, it's very obfuscating and it's confusing because there are real issues between Greek culture and Judaism and Yiddishkeit, and this wholesale condemnation blurs those differences. Rav Lichtenstein every year was really fascinating in yeshiva. Rav Amital would use the Hanukkah Masiva as an opportunity to give his yearly update on Zionism and redemption. And it constantly changed because Rav Amital was someone who was always changing his mind. And it's fascinating to attend and listen to what he felt, how this redemptive arc or trajectory was altered now that we were going through the Intifada or the Second Intifada or Asla or Sabra and Shatia. It was really fascinating. Rav Lichtenstein would give a 3-hour lecture about Judaism and Greek culture as we're falling into our schnitzel. Is it finished yet? Can we eat our schnitzel? There was a very, very, very sharp contrast between Rav Lichtenstein's sophisticated tour de force presentation about Judaism and Greek culture and Rav Amital's very redemptive and fiery description about where this process in Israel is heading. But Rav Lichtenstein taught us to assess Greek culture much more delicately, much more refined, greater precision, rather than just simply rejecting everything Greek, because not only does it blur the really important differences, because if you reject them all, you don't face any moral challenges, but there are some real moral challenges in Western civilization, which is a descendant of Greek Roman culture. And the second issue is it's wrong. It's the way Chazal saw it. And I'll show it to you in a moment. Chazal didn't see Greek culture and Roman culture as bankrupt of any values. And it's very dichotomizing. You're all looking at the people whose cameras are on. You're all sitting in homes that are structured on Greek math and Greek science. And you're all part of democracies that are the legacy of the first polis state that Greek established. So it creates almost schizophrenia. I'm not Greek, but I am Greek. When I'm in the base medrash and I'm pontificating about how terrible Greece is, so nothing of Greece matters. And then I walk out of the base medrash and I'm essentially part of a Greek-inspired Western culture. So it leads to a lot of schizophrenic religious identity rather than holistic religious identity, which is what we're trying to accomplish. So in the spirit of Rav Lichtenstein, I wanted to spend some time itemizing 3 or 4 areas in which Greek culture differed from our Masorah. And when I say Greek culture, I don't mean that Plato and Socrates were on the battlefield with the Maccabees. It's ridiculous, right? Plato was 4th century, Socrates was 5th century, and the Hanukkah miracles and the 30-year wars of Hanukkah occurred in the 2nd century BC, of course. It means that there's a larger battlefield, which I'll discuss in a moment, that's metaphysical, and that Greek culture provided certain challenges to humanity. And we faced off against them in those challenges, and we not only prevented those toxic ideas from infiltrating human culture, but allowed the positive and the favorable parts of Greek culture to then enrich humanity and launch the human spirit. So it doesn't mean that the Hashmonaim were fighting. Of course, it wasn't just chronological. The Greek Empire was vast, and who is to know whether the Seleucids who fought Yehuda Maccabee were supporters of Plato, supporters of ancient Greek mythology? We're talking about larger cultural encounters rather than a specific moment in which Greek idea was posed, challenged Jewish ideas. So without further ado, let us begin with the following. To me, it's the fundamental medrash of seeing Hanukkah broadly rather than myopically. The medrash describes the darkness and the void that occurred or that existed before the creation of the world. Source number 1, darkness, void, choshech, confusion, chaos. Chazal saw these four phrases: Tohu, number one; Bohu, number two; Choshech, number three; Tehom, the abyss, number four, as referencing the four famous empires. Tohu ze Bavel, Bohu ze Madai, Persia; Choshech ze Yavan, Greece; and then quote the end of it, but Tehom, the endless abyss, is the endless duration of Christian-based Western civilization's persecution of the Jewish people. Namely, Greece is part of this series called the Four Malchios. The Four Malchios that were described to Avram Avinu at the Bris Bein Abisarim, that were part of Daniel's dreams and Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, that were forecast to Yaakov according to some Midrashim at the Sulamutzav Artzav Rosh Magia Shemaima. Now, these four empires with which we battle, Babel, Persia, Greece, and Rome, are not just four ancillary, incidental empires that happen to persecute us and against whom we respond. These are four major world powers that rise to glory, dominate the world's imagination, and threaten the world with moral challenges, because each of these cultures provide morally toxic, morally dangerous ideas. And in our face-off with these four cultures, we are protecting humanity from its own darker self. By defeating Babel, we protected humanity from the infiltration of very dangerous Babylonian ideas, which would lead to moral torpor or moral decay. By defeating Persia, obviously, we protected the world from the rampant hedonism and ostentation that we see on display in Ahasuerus's party. By defeating Greece, we protected the world from some of the Greek ideas, Grecian ideas, which I'll hopefully try to very quickly summarize today. By defeating Rome, or continuing to defeat Rome, we play that same role. So the four empires are not just a way to nicely frame the four challenges we faced, but this is the gist of the Maharal in a sefer of his called Ner Mitzvah. In Ner Mitzvah, he digs down beneath the hood of these four empires and sees them as historical framing for the moral crusade which the Jewish people are involved with. We're a moral crusade on behalf of humanity. We're the vanguard of humanity. We defend humanity, and we defend them against Babel, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And of course, Greece is part of that. But keep in mind, I'll open up that screen share again. As opposed to Babel, which is called Tohu, and Madai, Persia, which is called Vohu, the Greeks are called Choshech. Now, Choshech is obviously darkness, but it's not void, it's not chaos. It's just darkness. It's just shading truth. And this has sources in the Sfas Emes as well. I won't go into the Sfas Emes. And this means that Greece didn't just provide moral challenges to humanity, which we fended off in our Hanukkah defeat and conquest of Greece, but benefits and favorable ideas in philosophy and science and civilization and politics and inquiry and scientific method. And so Greece is not tohu vavohu, it's not void and meaningless. And that's why Chazal harbored appreciation for Greek culture. Source number 4, the Mishnah and Megillah. Although the Tanakama believes you can write a Sefer Torah in any lashon, Mishnah Megillah Chasam Beis is a lot more conservative. You can't just write a Sefer Torah in any language, because all the other languages which are in Hebrew are seen as substandard languages. But Mishnah Megillah Omer Af B'Svarim Sefer Torah Lo Hitiru Sheyichtavu El Yavanis. You can only write the Sefer Torah in Greek. Because Chazal saw Greek as a cultured, civilized nation. That's what made the challenge so unique. Until the face-off of Hanukkah, we had battled savage, violent, paganistic, voodoo, blood drinkers, head decapitators, basically battling savage beasts. So the fact that we didn't defect to these cultures was not a sign of our heroism and our commitment to our Kodesh Baruch Hu's Torah. Why would we want to be blood-sucking, voodoo-worshipping, idol-bowing savages when we can have a dignified system of life, which the Torah offers us? But during Hanukkah, Judaism, for the first time, came into contact and conflict with a real civilization. Civilization that had organized life, that had ordered its world. The word cosmos is a Greek word. I'll talk about this later, for order and organization. And that's why another way, there are basically 3 ways to metaphorize the 4 empires. One metaphor are the animals or the animal-like grotesque figures on the idols of Nebuchadnezzar and on the idol that Daniel saw, the animals that Daniel saw in his dream. The other way are the 4 metals. Metals is important because metals are useful. The 4 metals, Zav, Kesef, and Nechoshes, Ubarzel, and Zav, Kesef, and Nechoshes were incorporated in the Mishkan. And the third system for metaphorizing the four empires, are different animals that are not kosher. So, for example, Chazal saw in Parsha Shmini, source number 3, the Eshar Neves, the rabbit Zu Yavan. So why were the Greeks compared to rabbits? So that's an interesting analogy, in part because they were so multiple. This was the first multi-regional empire. So when you saw 300,000 soldiers amassed in the war that took place in Gush Etzion a year after Hanukkah, it was like armies no one had ever seen. Remember, Sancheri's army was the largest army ever assembled to that point in this region. It was 185,000. All of a sudden, Antiochus, a year after the Hanukkah, returned for the second stage of the battle. He gathered 300,000, so like rabbits. They're just multiplying like rabbits. But Chazal sees something a little different, because a rabbit has certain favorable traits of kashrus. It chews its cud. It doesn't have completely split hooves, it has split hooves on the top, but it chews its cud. So Nevis Zuyavan Ki Malaske Rahi Shemekalesis Lakadosh Baruch Hu. And we'll talk about where Yavan praised Lakadosh Baruch Hu. So our battle with the four empires is a battle to defend humanity against moral challenge. It's also a battle to filter some of these values that these empires can provide for humanity so that we can filter out the toxicity like a liver and provide all the benefits, and in particular with Greece. And that's why the famous pasuk in Noach, you can't even begin to articulate the encounter between Judaism and Greek culture without this pasuk. Source number 5, Elokim Liyefes, the Yishkon Ba'al Le'Shem. Canaan is, of course, the Eved, Cham's son, Canaan. But of the two sons of Noach, Yefes and Shem become the preferred children. Beauty, not just beauty, but science, knowledge, is delivered to Yefes, and it's streamed through the tents of Shem. So how do Chazal see this pasuk? Source number 6. My Tamid Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. What's the reason Rav Shimon ben Gamliel allows the Sefer Torah to be written in Greek? Amarkra Yafs Elokim Liyefes v'Yishkin Ba'al Le'Shem. Devar of Shel Yefes, literally the language of Yefes, you Ba'al Le'Shem, can now cohere and be streamed through Ohel Shem. And this is Chazal's way of not validating, but recognizing that Greek culture was not completely bankrupt, nor provided certain toxic challenges, which I'll hopefully talk about today when we finish with our introduction. So that's the first part of the introduction. Don't be simplistic. I have to tell you on an honest level, on a personal level, I hear sometimes things and ideas that people articulate about Hanukkah, they're shameful and they're appalling. It's so far from the truth. People just exploiting Hanukkah as an opportunity to say everything that is part of the West and part of non-Gentile culture is bankrupt and fraudulent and toxic, and just it's so far from how Chazal viewed DFS and Reb Shimon Gamliel viewed DFS, and it misses the point. It's not just simplistic; it misses the point. There's some real issues which I'll hopefully identify. And if you just have this wholesale condemnation and rejection, you miss the real issues, and it doesn't help. Because let's face it, we're part of Western culture, and we have to know which issues to defend ourselves against. The second issue to appreciate is that Hanukkah was not a one-off encounter. Hanukkah was part of a multi-century encounter between these two cultures. And to be honest, the Greeks were not just militant and intent on Lashkicham Tarasecha Ulavira Mechukei Ritzonecha. That was clearly the agenda of Antiochus, and that was what happened in 186 for Antiochus, I think the fourth, wanted us to forget our Torah. But many, many centuries before, the children of Yefes, in a sincere search for truth, realized that the road to truth lies through the prophetic lanes of Yerushalayim and not the philosophical halls of Athens. And that's why the descendants of Yefes migrated, pilgrimage to Yerushalayim to find truth. This is more or less what the Kuzari says in his introduction. So, for example, going back 200 years before Hanukkah, Hanukkah is in the 2nd century. This is now in the 4th century, when the entire pan-Greek empire began. What happens? Alexander the Great meets Shimon HaTzadik. Very famous Gemara in Yoma, source number 7. Kivan Shira l'Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the last members of the Anshe Knesset Haggadah. He descends from his mount and he bows. Alexander the Great, he was the feared leader of the entire world. He demolished the Persian Empire. And he bows to Shimon HaTzadik. And all of his assistants are shocked. Melech Gadol Kemoscha Yishtachav Eliyehudi Zeh. You're bowing down to this Jew? And Shimon HaTzadik says, well, this is the face that I see before each of my victories in my dream. And of course, he helps Shimon HaTzadik and the Jews fend off the agitation of the Shomronim, who were trying to conspire to subvert the Jews and to employ the Greeks to their service. But Shimon HaTzadik, Alexander the Great is effectively inspired by Shimon HaTzadik. more substantially, if you go back now 200 years before Hanukkah, these are all rough figures, but about 100 years before Hanukkah, what happens? Source number 8. Titania, Masai Betalmi Hamelech, Ptolemy II, in a Greek what's the word I'm looking for? An outpost in Egypt, in Alexandria, gathers the 70 Zakanim, 72 actually, and for the first time, the Torah is translated into a non-Hebrew language to make it accessible for the entire world. Now, without question, Chazal were very ambivalent about that moment, and that's why this translation of the Septuagint to the Targum Shivim is listed as one of the reasons that we fast in Shavasa, because that was the day it occurred. And there were certain challenges that this translation introduced. But in a global sense, if you ignore the particular thorny issues of translating, isn't this what Torah Shebachsav is meant to be? Torah Sheba'al is the unique province of Am Yisrael. It's our secret code of behavior and intellectual inquiry. You're now allowed to teach Torah Shebachsav, Torah Sheba'al to non-Jews. But Torah Shebachsav is intended to be an international document of morality and monotheism. That's why Hoel Moshe Be'eres Atar Azos, Rashi says in the beginning of Devarim, Moshe translated Torah Shebachsav into 70 languages, the Shivim Lashamas. That's why Hashem offered Torah Shebachsav to all the nations. Afiyami Harparan, V'yasam Rivos Kodesh, famous Medrash. Hashem offered it to all the world because Hashem wants Tanakh and wants Scripture, as it's called, the Bible, to influence, hopefully, without being corrupted. And sadly, it's being corrupted. So the translation of the Bible into Greek was, on the one hand, a tragic experience. We fast for it. But on the other hand, not everything is black and white. Not everything is binary. It had some tragic elements to it, had triumphant elements to it. And to appreciate the triumphant elements to it, pan out. Okay, Targum Shivim, the Torah was translated into into Greek in the third century. About 100 years before Hanukkah, which is in the 2nd century. Okay, what happens now? 600 years later. 600 years later, the world shifts. Here's one of my grandchildren with his carriage. I'm going to ask, guys, could you move out the? Hi, Dale. 3rd century. Guys, can you take out the L? Guys, can someone take out the L, please? I'm giving a lecture. Thank you. Sorry about that. It's a little bit fun here in the Taragin household over the last 2 months. Baruch Hashem, everyone say we'll continue to be so. So about 600 years later, the entire world shifts from paganism or polytheism of the Greeks and becomes monotheistic. In the Edict of Milan in the 4th century, the Roman Empire becomes Christian. Now, Christianity is not a pure blend of monotheism, but it's still a better religious orientation than the ancient paganism of human sacrifice and bloodthirsty drinking. And then 300 years afterwards, Islam arises. Who do you think the first Christian converts were? Well, sadly, many of the first converts to Christianity were Jews, sadly. But most of them were Greeks who were influenced by Judaism. There were huge populations of Greek citizens who had pseudo-Jewish behavior. They kept half Shabbos, the SMS had half Shabbos and whatever they had. So this encounter between Athens and Yerushalayim took place over hundreds of years, and it worked both ways. It's not just that the Greeks tried to influence us, but we influenced the Greeks. And our influence on Greece essentially led to the march of monotheism. And when Mashiach comes, he's going to enter into a world that's basically monotheistic, and it'll have to empty Christianity of its leftover pagan influences, of course. There's no physical construct to Kodesh Baruch Hu Chas v'Shalom. He's going to have to purge Islam of its militantism, of its desire for blood and conquest. But essentially, Mashiach will not have to convert a pagan world into a monotheistic world. The world is essentially monotheistic already, with whatever corruptions occur. And of course, in Ramban, if you look at the Ramban in the 13th century, after the disputation in Barcelona, he writes a sefer to the very dispirited community because he won the dispute, but of course, Jews never won disputes. And the community was dispirited, and the Ramban was forced to flee to Yerushalayim, and to Akko, then to Yerushalayim. And he writes in a little sefer called Taras Hashem Tamima that essentially we have mixed feelings about the rise of Christianity. Historically, it was awful. Historically, it was horrific. But religiously, it represents the advance of humanity to a religion that's closer to monotheism. It's hard for us to call it pure monotheism, but it's a religion of civility, it's a religion of compassion, it's a religion of one God, and we take these things for granted. But they're much closer to where we want them to be than the pagans with whom our ancestors cohabitated or lived with, or lived amongst them. So this is just a very large introduction so that the whole discussion of Greece doesn't default into a simplistic and incorrect and fraudulent, it's all trafe, and they were all trafe, and they were barbarians, and we defeated them, they were all elephants. It's not what happened. The question is, what did happen? What are the differences between Athens and Yerushalayim? Now, I see on my clock, I only have another 23 minutes or so. I have to run to a wedding. But I will refer you to a series on this, and I'm hopefully going to continue to produce. I produced the first 3 parts. They're on Why Utara. I hope I'll get the time because I don't really have so much time to think, let alone to record, but to highlight 8 differences between Greece and Athens. I'll just talk about 3 of them, and hopefully I'll continue them on the series. Number 1. Okay, number 1. I spoke about before the fact the word cosmos is a Greek word for order. For the ancients, the natural world was frightening and random and unpredictable. And they lived with constant tension and constant fear and constant anxiety. You didn't know which flood would obliterate your home, or which wild animal would attack you, or which magical voodoo, grotesque god would descend and defeat you. And the Greeks, through scientific inquiry, began to organize the world and make the world a more predictable place to live. Through science, through math, and predictability brought stability, brought confidence. The world was ordered and organized. It could be predicted. And on top of that, now that they weren't in a fight for survival, just to survive the next day, they could start to articulate the larger issues of life. So science enabled philosophy. So the fact that Archimedes was a mathematician and a scientist as well as a philosopher, now that the world was organized, you had space and tranquility to think about the larger questions of life: eternity, soul, virtue, morality, community, or whatever their versions of gods were, whether it's the polytheistic gods of Greek mythology or the gods of Plato and Socrates. But they had a workable, civilized way to lead their lives. But here's the problem. It created 2 challenges. One is, which I won't elaborate tonight, it left little to the realm of mystery. Religious life is a very delicate balance between cognition and mystery, between what we know and what we don't know, between this world and other worlds, between science and irration. And there was a tilt towards hyper-rationality and hypercognition. And anything which can't be proven doesn't exist. And you'll see certain shades of that in the modern empirical world, the modern Greece, in which anything that can't be proven just doesn't exist. That's why I think learning Kabbalah, studying Kabbalah is so helpful, because it checks against that imbalance. That's just a quick summary of the first danger. The larger danger that Greek posed was a religious danger. When you live in a world that's unstable and that's frightening, with anxiety, you reach out to a higher being for support, for dependability, for assistance. And when you live in a world that's organized and that's dependable and that's predictable, without tension, without anxiety, then all of a sudden you're less in need of a higher being. I think it was a Goethe once said that before man had the skill to move mountains, he needed the faith to move mountains. And the Greeks had too much skill and not enough faith. And even their faith in God, God was a contemporary of theirs, rather than a higher authority to whom you submitted, to whom you. Rav Lichtenstein had this amazing lecture once. And I have a summary on it on why you tell. One more of an elaboration for this, because Rav Aaron's ideas were so sophisticated, they need interpretation, even though they were said in English. He compared Prometheus to Eo. And it was a stunning lecture. Both suffer perceived divine injustice. Prometheus steals fire from the gods, is bound to a rock. Eo, of course, is a tzaddik who suffers presumed divine injustice. But in Eo's struggle with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's a transcendence. Hashem is always this upper being, and he's railing against that authority, but he recognizes there's a hierarchy to the structure. And in Prometheus, he's one and the same with the gods, with Zeus. And he may be weaker than Zeus. He may not have the strength of Mercury, but they're in an equal setting. They're contemporaries. And this is what, and Rav Aaron quoted, ironically, when he gave us the Shir on Hanukkah, just to show you how intellectually honest he was, he quoted Tennyson often. Tennyson was a 19th century British poet who said that this humanism was the primary injury of ancient Greece to religious thinking, because it created an anthropocentric world as opposed to a theocentric world, in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is at the middle of our universe, and we submit to him, and he's transcendent. And as Yeshaya Hanavi writes, source number 9, Ki lo machshivosai machshivosechem v'lo darchechem derachaynu Hashem. My thoughts are in your thoughts. Plato would not agree with Yeshaya. No, hey, in Plato's world, whatever image of God he has, it could be copied and pasted into the human intellect. Rather than seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu as this beyond, transcendent being that I can't begin to imagine, no human word, and the best I can do is study the moral footprints of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and try to replicate them, or study his Torah and better know him. So transcendence was completely absent from the Greek view of their gods. And that's why, at least, both in the mythological system of gods, which was laughable because those gods were essentially human beings, just written larger, more muscular, greater sexual and monetary appetites, living on a mountain, but essentially their conduct resembled human conduct with all of its vices and all of its pockmarks. And even as you get to the more sophisticated views of God in Plato and Socrates, you don't have this transcendence. And transcendence is quickly disappearing from our world. Post-Holocaust, Hashem was very frightening to people. And because of that, our generation, I mean, the generation, the second and third generation after the Holocaust, we were able to translate Hashem into a friendly grandfather, not a father in heaven, but a grandfather in heaven. Father in heaven is frightening. A grandfather in heaven is cute. My grandkids aren't afraid of me. They're afraid of their father. My kids are, well, they used to be afraid of me, not anymore. So my grandkids, they come to me for chocolate. They come to me for favors. They come to me for a lollipop. So we want a grandfather in heaven, not a father in heaven. And we're losing transcendence. We're losing and this is part of the seductive whisper of Western culture in which God is compassionate and favorable, and what can religion do for me, rather than how can I serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Number two, the second, this is still issue number one, but subset number two. The second danger of Greek humanism is that human beings no longer have Tzelem Elokim. We believe that there is a one God responsible for all of reality, who's autonomous from nature, who created similar autonomy in us. That's Tzelem Elokim. Just like Hashem is different from nature, we're different from nature. And we possess traits that nature doesn't possess, that are roughly similar to Hashem: freedom of choice, consciousness, creativity, whatever traits we possess, they're separate from animals, trees, rivers, and they're resembling HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, we, you and I, and every human being that walks this planet is a unique creature, the masterpiece of creation, touched by the whisper of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we have to respect that Tzelem Elokim. In Greece, human beings didn't have a Tzelem Elokim. There's no unique image or quality that human beings were invested in, because there was, quite frankly, no Elokim to endow that Tzelem. And that's why even in the entire creation story is very, very murky in Greek mythology. There are many different stories about how warring and rival gods created different parts of nature. It's like a story, it's not a major event. And in Socrates and in Plato and in Aristotle, it's not something in which you have a divine figure who then issues Tzelem Elokim. I thought about that a lot. I just published an article in Jerusalem Post, up a weekly column, because I think that this struggle with Hamas is also a struggle over Tzelem Elokim for very, very different reasons. In the Greek world, the Tzelem Elokim didn't exist because there was no divine author to deliver it. In the world of Islamic fundamentalism, God is angry. So if God is angry, then why shouldn't you just kill and murder and make God happy? Because God is happy when people die and when blood is spilled. So I wrote this article, which maybe I'll link at the end of the video. I'll send to you all to link in the next session, about Hamas and Hellenism and what the overlays are, because it is important to try to tie our current struggle, the ideological battle, to past battles as well. The third aspect, very quickly, of the first issue is that, of course, in Greek religion, there's no commandments. There's absolutely no mitzvahs. There's no submission. Why should there be submission? God is an idea. God is some demiurge, the language that Plato used. And I want to try to think about morality through those ideas. But part of our avodas Hashem is that we're mitzvah v'yosef. And we access HaKadosh Baruch Hu not just through the thoughts and the articulation of religious identity, but through action and submitting our will. So this is one whole field in which Greece challenged the human spirit. And as I said before, because it didn't have Tzelem Elokim, because it didn't have transcendence, it had to be defeated. Because these are basic tenets of monotheism: transcendence, Tzelem Elokim, commandments. We had to defeat that culture so that monotheism could continue to evolve. And again, lahavdil, 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 Christianity adopted some of these elements. There is a somewhat semi-transcendence in Christianity. It's of course balanced by the fact that God had a son, Chas v'shalom, which is ridiculous, and there is commandments which were then ignored, and there is a sense of Tzelem Elokim, which I think still exists in the heart of Christian ideology. So we defeated Greece. How would religion have evolved had Greece not been defeated? We would have people studying Plato and Socrates and thinking about Zeus and Apollo. And thank God that's not the world we inhabit. That's number one. Number two is, how did ancient Greece view time? Plato spoke of absolute ideas and absolute essences. He objectified this world into higher, more abstract concepts. So I'm sitting on a chair. This chair is in Alon Shvut, and it's in my room, my Sfarim room, but it's really a reflection of a Platonic chair, which is in heaven. So when you say Platonic relationship, you don't really mean a relationship without romance. You mean the ideal relationship, Platonic. It's the ideal. The image, the metaphor that Plato suggested was a person sitting in a cave and making gestures or living their life in front of a fire. And all their motions are projected as shadows against the wall of the cave. And the person who walks by the cave, you can look this up in Google, Plato's cave analogy. People that walk by the cave see all these shadows being cast on the wall. So you're not really watching the person, you're watching the projection of the person's actions. Everything in this world is a projection of something higher. Now, before you deride this is absolutely crucial because it allows classification. And classification allows to organize your world. So when I go out, for example, in the 20th century after Linnaeus, and I see a bug on the floor, I say, okay, now which set does this bug belong to? And I'll know whether it's venomous or not venomous, I'll be able to classify. All briskers create classifications. The sharper your classifications, the more you can take shots and organize it into categories rather than this endless stream of ideas. So classification is crucial, and classification can only be achieved by abstraction. So everything is just anecdotal. There's the lamp in my room in Alon Shvut, and the lamp in Yoel's room, and wherever he's sitting in Petach Tikva. But if I say there's this objective lamp, this Platonic lamp, and every lamp is an example of that, it's not mishigas, it's not nourishment, it's important. But here's the issue. Once you objectify all reality to something larger than the current moment, you play with the concept of time because time changes. Absolutes don't change. So how do you reconcile living in a world of absolutes and living in a world of time? The answer is you murder time. Time doesn't exist. The world is either eternal or, as many Greeks believe, time doesn't exist. Now, many of you may have heard, if you haven't, another thing to Google, you have homework. Google Plato's cave and Google Zeno's paradox to prove that there's no time. He had a series of paradoxes and experiments to prove the tortoise and the hare and the arrow that was shot. So time either was static, eternal, or didn't exist. Now we, meaning you and me and all of the other Bnei Yisrael, we have a different term for time. We call time history. And history has a beginning, Maaseh Bereishis, and history has an endpoint, Yemos HaMashiach, a terminus. And the trajectory that leads from the beginning, Tov Vavo, to the endpoint, we call that terminus. We call that process, I'm stopping the screen share, we call that process redemption. And in Greece, there is absolutely no sense of a redeemed world. The world is static. The world is just projections on people's caves. The projections don't change. We live through history, and history shifts. Human beings affect history. As the proxies of Hashem, we're uniquely qualified to drive the arc of redemption, and we change history and drive it to its inevitable and inexorable endpoint called Yemos HaMashiach, Geula. And of course, for Jews, Geula, Yemos HaMashiach is not a parochial event, it's a universal event, in which Vayashem L'melech al kol haaretz, v'yeda kol pol ki ata pi'alto, v'vin kol yitzor ki ata yitzarto, v'yamar kol Hashem neshama b'apo. And hopefully the chaos that we're living through now is part of this process in ways that we can't fully understand or can't fully decipher. Now again, don't underestimate how important the concept of redemption is, not just for us, but for all of humanity. Where would humanity be if they didn't imagine a dynamic world that could change and improve? How often do people use the term redemption as a metaphor? How often do people use the term going to the promised land? Just ask Martin Luther King. If we hadn't defeated Greece in the 2nd century, I don't think Martin Luther King would have said, I have a dream and I'm taking you to the Martin Luther King to free people who were discriminated against and were disadvantaged. That echo was picked up from a world which had redemption, which had migration to the promised land. So the second major cultural challenge between Greece and the Torah, between Yerushalayim and Athens, was not just transcendent religion versus seeing God as on a par and a God. And the Kuzari writes about the God of Abraham and the God of Aristotle, the God without commandments, the God without transience, the God without Tselem Elokim being endowed to human beings. The second difference is how we experience time. Because Greece objectified reality to higher absolute essences, time became either static or non existent. We live in a changing experience called history, which is dynamic and which we could directly affect by our behavior and our actions. The third and final area in which Greece and the Torah, Lashkicham Tarasecha, clashed, in which there was a cultural conflict between Athens and Yerushalayim, was the complete and total absence of tzedakah, or as we call it, compassion and charity from ancient Greece. Now, this is a little bit confusing because the word philanthropy, and here's a good chance to let everyone know that Yoel Weiss is the executive director of the Gush fundraising division. So if anyone likes the word philanthropy, he's the address. You can send your checks to the Etzion Foundation. But the word philanthropy is actually a Greek word. Philanthropia is a Greek word. However, it does not mean what it means in the current context. It does not mean charity, compassion, kindness, altruism. It meant what we would call hospitality, showing graciousness to people, hosting them, showing them favors. It was very, very transactional. You gave because you expected. It was almost like a cultural rite, a cultural play. You came to my house, I showed you favor. I came to your house, you showed me favor. It was extremely limited to the upper class. There was absolutely no record in Greece of supporting the weak. Or why should you? Because the weak and the financially indigent obviously weren't favored by the gods, because the gods would have made them rich, or would have made them strong, or would have made them powerful, or would have made them noblemen had they been favored by the gods. So why should you show favor to people who the gods discriminate against? Remember, in this carnival of gods, gods play favor. We believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't play favor. He loves everyone on the Zoom equally. So if one person is more privileged or less privileged, whatever. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has whatever decisions he has. But I have to respect you the same way you have to respect me, not for reciprocity or for transactional equity, but because HaKadosh Baruch Hu cares about human beings. And if he cares, then we have to care. Mahu rachum, afatah rachum, mahu chanun, afatah chanun. There's no record of any organized charities in Greece. In fact, the weaker members of society were seen as a drain on society and quickly became slaves. Hannah Arendt, in her fascinating book, I don't recommend becoming a fan of Hannah Arendt, but I recommend reading some of her works, The Human Condition, talks about how in ancient Greece, she highlights the point, you couldn't join the Senate if you didn't have slaves or assistants to take care of your children. Being part of a family that were weak was seen as a sign of weakness. That should be discharged. I believe deep down, and this is why part of the reason that Chazal were misakin the menorah al Pesach Beso Mibachutz. Why were Chazal misakin it there? Obviously for Persumei Nisa, but there's something about the bias, and the chiyuv is only to have a bias, right? If you don't have a bias, you don't have to light. So it's not just choosing a location that would ensure maximum Persumei Nisa. It's also fixing it. It's the only three mitzvahs that if you don't have a house, you're literally potter from. One is mezuzah, one is a makkah, and one is adlakas neros. If you're homeless, chas v'shalom, you're not chayv. In fact, there are big questions now in Gaza about if you're living in a tank, which many of our tzaddikim soldiers have to live for several weeks at a time. What do you light? Baruch Hashem, since the last war, all these tanks come outfitted with a little, and of course, you can't light in the tank. That's not a wise idea. But all these tanks can't light a candle. All these tanks come outfitted with a little shell that pops out, and you can light the menorah on the shelf. And being that the tank is there makom dira, you can light there. But I secretly believe that part of the reason Chazal wore misakein, Mitzvahs Chanukah Lenicha Pesach Beis Mibachutz, was to counter some of this anti-family attitude and anti-home attitude that high Greek culture possessed. It was embarrassing people. I spent the last 72 hours running after my grandkids. That's what Hashem wants from me now. I haven't had time to learn much. I haven't had time. I haven't had time to clean the kitchen today. I don't count. I need multiple hands. I think it's what Hashem wants from me right now. That's just as much a part of my avodas Hashem as whenever I get a chance to learn. I'm running out to a wedding right now, and this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from me right now. So I'll do it as carefully as I can. So the absence of charity and kindness, and again, just think about how Western culture would have been different if it had been Greek influence rather than monotheistically influenced. Every part of healthy Western culture recognizes charity, recognizes altruism, celebrates compassion, celebrates mercy. Now, one can claim that many have claimed that Christianity took it too far, and everything is compassion without any consequences, and too much mercy and too much. That's a whole different conversation, and I'm the least qualified to discuss that because I'm not a Christian theologian. I was looking at it from the outside and hearing people talk about how there's a balance between responsibility and mercy, compassion, and mitzvahs and whatever. These are three flashpoints between Athens and Yerushalayim. And I hope you're able to realize how deeply our defeat of the Greeks altered history. Had Greece victored, who knows how God would have been seen in our world. It would have been seen basically as an updated version of the Greek mythology. These are cartoons, these are children's stories. Greek mythology, they're fascinating stories, stupidity, narishkeit, garnishment garnished. Or God would have been seen, even in a more hypothetical version, as some equal to the human experience, maybe a little stronger than us, or some idea, some concept, rather than Ribono Shel Olam, Adon Kol Haaretz, who stood at Har Sinai and delivered Torah and mitzvahs to us, and who endowed us with Tzelem Elokim as he is uniquely qualified to endow. Number one, transcendent religion or calm, tranquil relationship with Hashem, humanism, anthropocentrism, or theocentrism. Number two, how do we experience time? Is it static? Does it even exist? Or do we all feel we're living in history? This is a historical moment. It becomes almost second nature to us because we feel like we mean it's a historical moment. Somehow it's part of our past and somehow it will affect our future. We know we've been placed in this historical moment and we all have to step up to the plate and perform our historical responsibility. That's not a Greek language. A Greek language is we're living in some shadow world of projected essences, and there's no change to that world, and you just live your life. And try to consider and incorporate as many of those eternal essences as you can. And there's no redemption. And what would a world be without redemption? Not just on a religious and moral plane, but on an industrial plane. All the progress in science is predicated on the belief that we can change our world. That if we have corona, we can develop a vaccine. If we have limitations to transportation, we can innovate new ways of transportation because the world is dynamic and we can improve it. And the world is surging to a better place. And the third primary issue is charity, compassion, Rahmanis, just to end on a positive note. Everything has been positive, but just to end on a note. The Rambam writes, Kol Mishu Achzari, source number 12, if you're hard-hearted and unsympathetic and cruel and merciless, Eino Merachem, and you don't have Rahmanos Yesh, Lachosh Liachasar, you have to warn that person's a Jew. She'en Hachzarias Mitzui Etzel Ba'akum. Never Achzarihim of V'lo Yirachmu. V'chol Yisrael v'Alnil v'Alem ki Achem Heim. Never Banu Matem Hashem Elokechem. V'lo Yirachem Ha'achalach Mi Yirachem Allah. Can't think of a better way to end this year during the period that we're experiencing. V'chol Yisrael v'Alnil v'Alem ki Achem Heim. The events of the past 2 months have shown us how much we really are Achim, because we're Banu Matem Hashem Elokechem. Some of us know it, and that's why we feel like we're brothers. Some of us, it's instinctual. It's primordial. They may not be able to articulate it, but they know it also. It comes out in different ways, not in religious fashion. Mirz Hashem, I'm looking forward to continuing to see all of my brothers on this Zoom cast in Mirz Hashem. And we should continue our challenge to protect humanity from its darker self and stand for light and stand for the values of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ashreinu Matov Chalkeinu, they were chosen for this. But as you know, historical mission carries a heavy price tag. But Ashreinu Matov Chalkeinu, that we didn't flee from that price tag. We were happy to take the challenge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu historical mission. Chanukah Sameach to everyone, and a big yeshkach to Yellow for organizing this year.